because it was Walt's, one of his kind of final dreams, right? There was sort of like Disney World / Epcot, Mineral King, and maybe like CalArts, sort of the three big things that were being worked on then. So I think that kind of gave them really extra oomph to try to get that stuff done kind of at all costs.
That is Greg Glasgow, who is here with Kathryn Mayer to talk about their new book, Disneyland on the Mountain. You are listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 216 of the Tomorrow Society podcast, now coming out on a weekly basis. I am your host, Dan Heaton. Very excited to bring you this episode with Kathryn Mayer and Greg Glasgow, the authors of the really cool book, Disneyland on the Mountain, Walt, the Environmentalists, and the Ski Resort That Never Was, which talks all about the history of Disney's Mineral King project in California, which was a ski resort that Walt had a dream to do and that went really far in the planning, never ended up happening. But there is a very interesting story about that. And Kathryn and Greg present both the Disney side, but also the people that did not want development at Mineral King from the Sierra Club and other organizations. Super interesting, so let's dive right in. Here are Kathryn Mayer and Greg Glasgow. Thank you both so much for talking with me.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, we're excited to talk to you.
It's rare to have a pair, so I'm impressed. I like it.
We're already stumbling upon each other, even for the hellos. So this is what happens today is anyone's.
Well, I enjoyed the book quite a bit. I know about Mineral King, but it's mostly like, oh, the Country Bears, and Walt wanted to do that, and then there was a fight. But I did not know the story at all. So I'm curious for you, how you initially got interested in this project and then making it a subject of a book.
Actually, what you said is kind of exactly how I was about it. I grew up as a big Disney person. I grew up with the movies and everything like that and the shows, and growing up going to Walt Disney World with my family. So I had been certainly a Disney person lifelong. And when Greg and I got married, kind of got him into the fold. But for this story in particular, especially as I got older, I was very interested in Disney history and kind of how, a lot of the Walt stories and a lot of the unbuilt projects and things like that really had piqued my interest. And we had, I think both of us had known, very basics, maybe had heard about, this had happened at one point. They tried to build the ski resort, didn't work out. And we had gone to the Walt Disney Family Museum a few years back when we were in San Francisco, which was, I don't know if you've been there, but a great, great museum.
I haven't, but I would love to get there.
It's phenomenal. And they had this giant timeline of Walt Disney's life. And it did mention, again, so briefly, and of course, anyone who knows Walt Disney knows he has he has a phenomenal timeline of all the accomplishments he had done. And it did mention very briefly that this Mineral King project. And it also said on that timeline that his partner was this man named Willie Schaeffler. And that was his partner on the project, essentially. And we had recognized that name because we both live in Colorado. And he was very famous in Colorado. He was German born, but had come to the state and basically was responsible for creating a lot of famous ski resorts and slopes and runs and things like that. But he was also the head coach at the University of Denver for many years. And the university is where the two of us had worked for their magazine for many years. It was my alma mater. So we were like, oh, that's so weird. I had no idea he was involved with Walt Disney, of course, this project. So that especially piqued our interest. And we're like, and again, I had no idea that it had even gone. It was so far that they had, a partner on it. I didn't exactly know much about the story other than at one point maybe they tried to build it. So that just, yeah, it piqued our interest, and we just kind of kept digging and realizing, a couple of the Disney blogs and things like that, of course, have mentioned it. And I think there's a very small mention in, the famous Bob Thomas biography of Walt. But, sometimes people even got it kind of misconstrued as far as, oh, they gave up on the project after Walt Disney died. And that wasn't true. And there's a lot of things that people didn't really understand. They didn't really understand the whole scope of it. And of course, we only understood that after we researched. And we just thought, this, the fact that this lasted for a decade and a half, or even more, if you're whatever timeline you're kind of thinking when it starts, we thought, hey, this sounds like a great story. Let's try to tell it. So the beginning of it really was us wanting to find out selfishly more about it and just interesting. We just thought it was really fascinating. And then we're like, I wonder if there's a book here. And that's kind of how it started.
So when you were starting to dig into it, then you mentioned a few things that surprised you. How did you go about doing that? Because I know there's a lot of news articles, and I mean, there are some people involved who are still alive, but kind of what was your approach then to dig further? Because like you said, like I know the surface level, and I think the same stories get repeated a lot, and it's mostly around the country bears and around, like you said, Walt's passing and, his true life adventures and everything else. But how did you kind of approach it when you wanted to dig further?
I mean, it was pretty scattershot. I think in the beginning was just sort of, trying to cast a wide net and kind of go beyond just the sort of 3-4 paragraph article on a Disney blog or something like that. We really started looking to like a lot of news articles from the time, which was really illuminating to kind of see, how it was being talked about in newspapers and things like that when it was happening. We found some great Sierra Club documents. So the Sierra Club was the organization that was sort of the main opposition to the project, and they have some really robust online like meeting minutes and oral histories and things like that. We found a good repository of like Disney annual reports. So it was really just kind of trying to round all this stuff up. And then we pretty early started reaching out to people that we could find that were, either people that were involved or the descendants of people that were involved. We pretty early on connected with one of the people in our book, Jean Koch, who was a cabin owner up in Mineral King. And she had collected tons of stuff over the years and actually donated all of her archive to University of Southern California. So we went out there to look through everything that she had donated. So we tried pretty early to kind of just, get as deep as we could, but it took a while.
Yeah. So, I mean, did you originally think there was enough for a book? Or, I mean, was this something where as you got more into it and then learned more that you started out like maybe and then realized like, were there some big surprises that made you realize, oh, wow, we can really do something with this?
Yeah, I mean, even the Supreme Court, even the fact that there was a case that went to the Supreme Court, I mean, I don't even know if that's anything that's like widely known or widely kind of talked about when it comes to Mineral King. So that was a huge part. The fact that they looked for another location in California at one point called Independence Lake was really interesting. Finding out kind of more about Walt and his really genuine love of nature and things like that, and how that would have sort of played out in this. Like, I think it did take a while. I mean, it's honestly hard to remember the moment where we thought, hey, let's write a book, because it's such a daunting thing. But I mean, I think at some point, and I think we looked, be like, oh, surely there's a book about this somewhere, and really kind of surprised that there wasn't, just because of what a rich story it was. And I think, like Kathryn said, it's just when all those pieces together, I think we kind of hit a critical mass at some point where it's like, okay, this really could be a book. Let's try it.
And I think also once we were piecing together, we kind of had like, I don't even know how many iterations we had of this, but then once we also were able to speak to a number of people and then and maybe they kind of connected us with someone else, we found another person. And once we found out like some of the main characters and who some of these big players were, and especially if and when we were able to connect with certain people like Jean Koch, who led the opposition at one point, Michael McCloskey, who is the head of the Sierra Club, who we also spoke to quite a bit. We spoke to Willie Schaeffler. Unfortunately, of course, a lot of the Disney players have passed on, but Willie Schaeffler's son we had spoken to and things like that, and actually some other ex-Disney employees and things like that. And again, once we had spoken to some of them and they provided a little more and we realized some color and realizing again how much how it kind of connected in context with, the environmental movement, which was really, the budding environmental movement at the time, which was really interesting. We thought, oh, that kind of connects to a really interesting moment in time, and how it connected to Walt Disney World and that opening, and Disneyland even opening years prior. So it was a lot of moving pieces. And once we realized, how some of these puzzle pieces essentially connected, we thought, it makes a little more sense to hopefully try to do this in book form.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, Greg, I was surprised. Like, I even thought, well, I'm sure there was a book, I just haven't read it, a book on it. Because, I've read a lot of books about Disney history, but there's a lot of books about Disney history out there.
Yeah.
So it surprises me that too. But then also, I found it interesting with both of you being journalists and kind of looking at it that way. You could approach the same topic just from the Disney side, and it would be a very different book. But what I found interesting is the way that you talked about what Disney was doing, but also it wasn't just like, oh, here's the hero and the Sierra Club's the villain, or the other way around. Either way, you kind of took it that way. So, I mean, did you approach this kind of similar to how you would approach, this is kind of a silly question, but like a journalism story where you're trying to kind of hit each side and tell it that way rather than focusing more on like Disney or one side of it?
No, that's not a silly question. I feel like it's funny because I don't think even at first we even comprehended. I think at some point, I remember there kind of being an aha moment, especially when, again, we collected kind of both sides, at least, at preliminary stages. And I remember telling Greg, I was like, wait, what if we kind of switch points of view every chapter, essentially? And I remember that just clicked for us, and we didn't think of that immediately. And I feel like once we did it, I feel like it told a much better story and was hopefully a more interesting story and narrative. But it was really important for us to do it that way. Again, of course, I'm not going to lie, I am a Disney person. I came into as a Disney fan, but it's such an important movement that we're also describing here. And like you said, I mean, we really weren't trying to tell it in this, like, there's not really this good versus evil hero and villain thing. It was, we really saw sympathy with both sides, and certainly the understanding of both sides. From the Disney perspective, it seemed very genuine, especially from Walt's point of view. It wasn't like they were just doing this for another money-making endeavor. I think a lot of people if you read the book, a lot of people that who were not Walt Disney, including even Roy Disney and others in the Disney company, kind of were like, why do you want to do this? Like they didn't even really quite understand it. And then of course the environmental side, it was bigger than Mineral King, this area that they were trying to develop. It was really kind of important to, again, that movement of the time. So yeah, it was really important for us to do it in that way. But we didn't think of that immediately. But things kind of were put in place, and we realized that was kind of the way to go. And hopefully it was a good read for people who read it.
Oh, for sure. And I'd love to ask you a little more about the environmental movement, because that's something, I didn't realize it played such an important role. And you referenced the Supreme Court case and how that works. So could you elaborate a little bit on that for someone who maybe isn't aware as much about how this impacted how, cases are brought to, courts, even as high as the Supreme Court, when, they're opposing certain development or different things the Sierra Club and other groups are doing?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously much more about it in the book, but really this whole Mineral King development really started in like 1965 was when Disney first won the rights for it. And, it was right around the time that the environmental movement was really starting to take off. And they really kind of chose this for whatever reason as kind of a real case that they really wanted to make a mark with and stick with. And, they did a lot of grassroots activism for the first few years. And then in 1969, they decided to go the legal route. And really is one of the first environmental lawsuits that they ever filed, and one of the first kind of big environmental lawsuits anyone ever filed. And certainly the first time they went to the Supreme Court. And there's something else that was interesting. It's like if you hear the story and you hear the Supreme Court case, your assumption probably is that, and then so Disney lost the Supreme Court case and that's why it never happened. But in actuality, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the resort going forward. But there were some dissents and things like that that really did kind of point the way, like you said, for the way that these are brought. And really, it had to do with kind of the standing that you have to bring the case. So, I mean, up until then, to bring any kind of lawsuit, you sort of had to show how you were going to be personally affected or financially affected by a development like this. What this case kind of laid the groundwork for was to say it's enough that you just want to protect an area that you see like the sort of aesthetic value of a place like Mineral King, and you're almost, in a sense, advocating or filing a lawsuit on behalf of that area. So sorry, it did make that kind of easier. Kind of that ethos started to creep in some, that, hey, you don't have to show personally how you're going to be affected. It's enough that you want to just protect the environment.
What was it about Mineral King that made it kind of such a touch point? You mentioned the time frame, which again fit with the environmental movement, but what was it about Mineral King that made it so something that got people so enthused to fight against development, basically? What was it about that area?
So part of it was, at the time, it was right next to Sequoia National Park. And a lot of people had thought it was actually only left out because of when they were kind of drawing the boundaries of it. There were some like old mining equipment and mining claims that were in that area. So it was left out of the park. But a lot of people had felt that it should have been in the park the whole time, which meant it would have been protected area and protected land and not allowed to be developed. So that was a big part of it. And there actually were a handful of cabins there as well. And if that Disney development happened, it wasn't 100% spelled out in black and white exactly what was going to happen. But of course, most people thought that those cabins would have been torn down to make room for this resort and for the ski runs. And another reason is that basically this area was like this had this primitive road that was extremely winding, extremely difficult to get into the area, and is still there to this day, by the way, which makes it take forever to get into this area. That was not going to do, if they were going to build this resort and have thousands of tourists and, have people see this area. So they were going to have to build this all-weather highway to replace this road, but it was actually going to have to cut through the park as well to Sequoia National Park. So that was another big reason why people were kind of up in arms about this development.
Yeah, it was interesting to read too with that highway, and also some of the kind of like monorail, railroad, different ideas they talk through, where it almost reminded me a lot, because again, similar time frame to when Walt Disney World was being developed and what they ended up doing there. And you even referenced there's a people mover that might have been there. Did those really get much steam? Because it's easy for me to look at it and go, wow, that would be really cool. But again, going through Sequoia National Park, it's hard for me to picture a monorail going through that park. It seems crazy.
Yeah, that was an interesting, I think, in the book, one of the very first inklings that they kind of got of this project that the Sierra Club heard way back, even before 1965, when Disney was just sort of very preliminary looking at this area, was the fact that they were sort of studying the feasibility of a monorail, which seems kind of bizarre to put a monorail or I think they maybe gave that up pretty fast. But it was really interesting to see, the different transportation option. I mean, there was the highway. Yeah, there was a railroad at play at some point. Sometimes it was a highway and a railroad. Sometimes it was just a railroad. Then there was the people mover. But everything was really pretty conceptual. I mean, the way that the lawsuits and everything happened, nothing really ever even got built up there. It was all just sort of plans and planning and what might work. And then they scaled the plans back at a couple points to kind of appease the environmentalists. But it was really interesting to see, first of all the transportation, how it changed, and then to see things like the people mover come into play. That, they were very excited at one press conference to kind of debut this technology and give the journalist a ride on the people mover that would have people would have basically parked underground, gotten on the people mover that would have split off into two tracks, one that went right to the slopes and then one that went to the hotels for people that were staying overnight.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I'm like, wow, that sounds amazing, having almost no concept of how much impact that would have. I'm just thinking of it in terms of me, selfish guest kind of thing. Like, and I'm not even a skier, but just in general. So, I know that a lot of us, like I mentioned earlier, are familiar with the Country Bear Jamboree and kind of what they were planning to do there. I mean, I'm trying to picture what if this resort had happened, what it would be beyond skiing and the Country Bears. I feel like there's more to it. I'm sure you studied some of their plans. I'm curious, how when you envision what it would have been like compared to like some of the Disney resorts and everything they've done, how would that compare to some of the like Walt Disney World and some of the resorts they've done?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big thing, of course, that Walt said at the beginning, like this is not going to be a Disneyland, this is not an amusement center. So our title is very, tongue in cheek as far as, a lot of people were fearful that it was going to be Disneyland on the mountain. However, once, it was a lot of like, he really wanted people to see some beautiful areas and actually like see a lot of these animals and things like that. Like I think we said in the book at one point, it was, they weren't going to be observing people like Donald Duck. They were going to observing, real animals and things like that. But then we had seen other rumors and we weren't able to completely confirm. But at one point they said they thought they were going to have like wilderness walks and talks, and maybe it was going to be led by Donald Duck. There was lots of ideas floating around. And of course, this development never began. They never started building it. But of course, they were thinking about it and creating the plans for it. But a lot of it was going to be very outdoor heavy. So it was a lot of ice skating and beautiful things like that, and sledding and horse-drawn carriages and things like that, probably in the winter months. And then the warmer months, it was going to be, hiking and again, those wilderness talks and walks and things like that. But it was also going to have, a movie theater and a chapel and a lot of things like that and shopping. And that was, I think when we think of the modern ski resort, that's kind of what we envision. We live in Colorado. That's very like a Vail type thing, a very famous resort, who actually later, by the way, took a lot of ideas from me. But so that was very modern. It was not something that people had thought about at all at the time. This was kind of revolutionary as usual. Disney, Walt ahead of his time thinking about this. But then it was going to have things like, we talked about the People Mover, which is kind of an attraction on its own. And they were going to build this Country Bear Jamboree. So I feel like if maybe they had started thinking about the Country Bear Jamboree attraction, chances are maybe a couple other things probably would have popped up. I would think, again, if that didn't happen, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side you look at. But yeah, I think it would have been really interesting to see all these, to see as well, these are some of the initial plans, but what would have happened, years down the road, because Walt had also said he used basically the same kind of verbiage he said for things like Disneyland when he said, this is not going to be finished. We're going to keep kind of creating and building. This is going to keep evolving. So it would have been really interesting to see how it would have kept evolving throughout the years, I think.
You start the book with Walt Disney, talking to the press in September of '66, which is kind of crazy because, he passed away 3 months later. Because he wasn't that involved, but yet his dream, kind of like with Epcot when he was going to do the city, and then they had to figure out what to do, and ultimately did the theme park. How did you go about kind of like making Walt a character and making him important presence while he was not alive for a lot of it?
Yeah, we really did want to make him a character. That was one of the big things in the book. We tried to create as many sort of characters as we could to make, read more narratively and things like that. But yeah, his spirit looms large over the whole thing. And, it was, like you said, it was kind of his dream. And we really tried to lay the groundwork for why this was important to him, how this got started. And I don't know that, if it hadn't been so important to Walt, there's probably no way they would have continued for another, 15 years or whatever it is. But
especially with the opposition.
Yeah, especially with the opposition. And they went to the courtroom. Disney didn't actually go to the courtroom, but the resort was part of this fight, and they, sat by while they did all these environmental studies. They looked at other locations. So, think like you said, because it was Walt's, one of his kind of final dreams, right? There was sort of like Disney World / Epcot, Mineral King, and maybe like CalArts, sort of the three big things that were being worked on then. So I think that kind of gave them really extra oomph to try to get that stuff done kind of at all costs,
Another thing you looked into was like Walt Disney and kind of what led to him being interested. And I thought it was interesting was the chapter about the 1960 Winter Olympics in Squaw Valley, which I knew nothing really about, except for that I knew they had been involved in it in some way with some of the entertainment. I'm curious to know a little bit more about that for people that maybe haven't read the book or don't know what Disney did and how that kind of led into this.
Yeah, that was another interesting piece I forgot to mention when talking about sort of the cumulative information that led to us thinking
Yeah.
it would be a book. Because once we heard about the Olympics, like, oh, this could be a chapter all unto itself. But yeah, basically, Walt Disney was, the Olympics were in Squaw Valley, California, which I think is now called like Tahoe West or something like that. But anyway, he was enlisted by these business leaders because they really wanted to bring some spectacle and kind of some California entertainment value. So he was the chairman of pageantry, and his duties were the opening and closing ceremonies. So kind of what we think as the opening ceremonies today with the parades of athletes and fireworks and big spectacle kind of all started with Walt and what he envisioned for that Olympics. And then he also was in charge of entertainment for the athletes. So this is kind of one of the first times they had an actual Olympic village with all the athletes living together in these kind of dormitories. And so every night, Walt would bring up friends of his, people that he knew from Hollywood to put on these nighttime spectaculars. And it was kind of with that happening that he's standing by taking notes. And this is also where he met Willie Schaeffler, the person that Kathryn mentioned earlier. So they're kind of together watching the success of the entertainment, of the spectacle, and starting to think like, gee, maybe we could do this even better or do this in a different way. It was kind of the seeds of that whole thing. So that was a really interesting part of the story for sure. And definitely another part where we're able to kind of bring Walt more to life and really hopefully, illustrate how this passion started.
Oh yeah, because for me, who's like you said, you referenced Bob Thomas's book, and there's a few other large books about Walt and everything. But again, they don't go that much in depth about
Mhm.
this side of it, at least from my memory. Another thing that was interesting is I didn't realize there were other fairly strong bids for this project because I've heard about the Disney bid, but reading about where you talked about, the competing bids, there's one bid in particular that was really strong. So, I mean, Disney probably had a pretty big leg up at Disneyland, but that really surprised me, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was really fun to find out about because were there five or six?
I think six
Six
total.
with Disney's. Um, and so yeah, so basically this area was from what the Forest Service. And so they said, hey, does anyone so again, a lot of the controversy is, oh, Disney wanted to develop this thing. It was whatever, but it was actually the US government who said, hey, this is a great area. This is going to make us some money. And make us some money, but also kind of make it available to people too, again, who maybe aren't athletic types and hiking and, waltzing up mountains on their own. They said they opened this area up for bids and they received, about six of them. And Walt Disney seemed kind of like the shoe-in. However, there were another bid. One that is fun to mention is a man named Robert Brandt, and Robert Brandt was, this very well-to-do stockbroker and did some interesting things in Hollywood at some point. Attractive man who happened to be married to an actress named Janet Leigh, who was of Psycho fame, the famous shower Psycho scene, and she was in Bye Bye Birdie, and very famous actress of the day. And so he really wanted to develop this area. He had gone to Mineral King quite a number of times, definitely a big skier, and he kind of envisioned it as this Nordic themed area with Vikings and everything like that. And there was this time where people had to come and present their bids. And Robert Brandt came in with a huge trailer behind him with big scale models. And everyone was very excited in the area, actually, which again is interesting to see kind of how public opinion changed later on and people didn't want this to be developed because when the bids had arrived on a day in 1965, Walt Disney actually showed up himself, hand-delivered his bids, talked to people, shook people's hands. Everyone was very excited about it. And they were also super excited because Robert Brandt showed up with Janet Leigh in tow. So it was these two big like Hollywood stars at this, this small area, smack in the middle of California. It's not, this isn't LA or anything like that. So pretty interesting. So it was very they took away some of the other bids, but it came down to Robert Brant's and it came down to Walt Disney's. And of course, Walt Disney eventually bested him in the end.
It's crazy to think about just because, again, like you mentioned earlier, kind of there's a lot more layers to it than we anticipated. And I want to make sure to ask you about the other side of it, really. We mentioned it a little bit earlier with the environmental movement, but how you presented the differing views in the Sierra Club. Because, again, it's easy to kind of look at it as Disney over here and the Sierra Club over here, but even they kind of had their own internal conflict based on past approvals and all that. So kind of how interesting was that for you as you dug further to see kind of the different elements of that club where, again, they didn't have such a united front?
Yeah, that was really interesting as well. Yet another piece that made us think, hey, this is a book. But yeah, it was so nuanced. I mean, essentially, like you said, the Sierra Club, about 15 or so years earlier, had sort of given approval to Mineral King. They were trying to stop development on another mountain in California. So they started looking, okay, is there another place we could recommend instead of this place? And they saw Mineral King and said, oh, that would be perfect. It already has, like Kathryn said, it's a former mining area. It already has some development and stuff like that. And they went as far as sort of making an official proclamation. The Sierra Club, has no problem with development here, blah, blah, blah. And then, 15 years later, when this happens and they have this big meeting, and the meeting they had was even before Disney had won the bid. This was basically a few months after the Forest Service issued the prospectus, and the Sierra Club had to figure out what to do. And just like you said, there was this big kind of split. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of Sierra Club members who are skiers. So, it's easy to look back and think, like you said, it's like black and white. There's like the Disney fans that want it, then everybody else doesn't. But, the reality is there's a ton of people that are just skiers, Sierra Club or not, that were really excited to see what a Disney resort was going to look like and to have a great resort a lot closer to home than anything that they had at the time. But at that meeting, they basically had to say, look, we gave approval for this 15 years ago, and it's quite likely that the Forest Service wouldn't have even issued this prospectus had they anticipated any opposition on our part. So there's a lot of contention, a couple of days of arguments of them saying, can we go back on our word? Is anybody going to trust us if we give approval and then we take it away? And then other people saying, well, but the times have changed. Now we're a lot more conservation minded and there's a lot more pollution, a lot more development that we're worried about. So they really went back and forth. And finally, they did issue the statement that they were opposed to the Mineral King development, but it wasn't without a lot of sort of hand wringing and a lot of yelling and fighting. And I'm sure there were people that, were still upset when that proclamation was made.
There's a lot of interesting info in the book about that side of it and just how, like you mentioned, the conflict that was there. Well, I mean, I know I don't want to have someone not read the book, but I'm curious. So what ultimately doomed the project? Beyond, I mean, Walt Disney was gone, and you mentioned that the Supreme Court case, they actually won at first. But, I mean, you mentioned now that they still, now it's not even something that's really up for debate. It's still there. But what was kind of some of the big issues that ultimately made this never happen?
Even after the Supreme Court, which again we found really interesting, and people, they'll read this in the book if they read it. But it was interesting because the opposition, weirdly enough, got even worse after the Supreme Court case. I guess it makes sense in the sense where, people thought, okay, let's try some other grassroots movements and things like that. But there was marches all over the area. There were hike-ins in the area where they basically took people into the Mineral King area and, this is so beautiful. We can't allow this to happen and things like that. There were protests outside of Disney stockholder meetings. There were protests. There was actually a protest on Disneyland at one point, which was really interesting. That got turned some attention. There was certainly negative press. I think again it was interesting because we combed through so many newspaper articles from early 60s to late 1970s, and you kind of saw how things shifted a little bit in the public eye because at the beginning it was, oh, cool, like another Disney resort. Let's see what this is going to look like. And then later it was like, no, we can't, not every area should be developed. So I think the opposition got pretty intense, even including after the legal battle. But the legal battle, I think, was kind of the beginning of the end because, of course, that was certainly a lot of negative attention for Disney. Even though they weren't technically named in the suit, they actually sued. The Sierra Club actually ended up suing the U.S. government instead of Disney, and it was a very deliberate choice because they thought people love Disney, basically. So we don't want to sue them because they thought they were afraid of the optics and they thought they were going to look like the losers, essentially, if they were to sue Disney. But it wasn't a good image look, for Disney. And a lot of people were very concerned about it. And, at some of these stockholder meetings that we had read about and got some notes from and things like that, people stood up and said, you should drop this project, essentially, like this is bad optics and things like that. So I think that was the beginning of the end. And then later, actually, politicians ended up getting involved in this fight. And President Jimmy Carter, actually, believe it or not, it led all the way up to the president, and he basically ended this battle with an initiative in 1978, which again people could read about it. But that's how the story ended. Is essentially a law that said we can't. This area is going to be protected because it was going to be part of Sequoia National Park. But there's a lot of other even more interesting things that I would think that I would say that happened in between the court battle and from that Carter proclamation.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's why I was like, I don't want to preempt anyone, but yeah. I think it's interesting to talk about, even though there's still a lot of steps along the way throughout, and interesting people, like you mentioned, who were, had strong backgrounds with it and everything else. Well, I know near the end of the book, you have a chapter where you talk kind of about the legacy. You already referenced Vail and kind of how that resort was put together, but kind of looking at this battle, either for Disney or just in general, kind of what do you think the legacy is of Mineral King and this resort that never ended up happening?
Yeah, there's so many that we kind of try to cover in the book at the last chapter. I mean, like you said, places like Vail, which you can read more about in the book, but they took very direct inspiration from the Mineral King plans and just ski resorts in general, as Kathryn said. I mean, just this idea now, what we think of as this family-friendly resort that's all year-round activities and has shops and restaurants and things like that. I mean, that wasn't super common in the late or mid 60s. So, I mean, that alone is sort of a legacy of it. Within Disney, you see a lot of echoes of sort of the Mineral King designs in different places like the Grand Californian or some of the, Animal Kingdom Lodge, places like that take inspiration from that sort of design. I think that even a place like Aulani, we talk about in the book, that was sort of the first Disney resort that really took inspiration from its surroundings, tried to blend. It wasn't a Polynesian resort or a contemporary. It was a Hawaiian resort in Hawaii. And I think that came out of some of the lessons learned from Mineral King about including the community that you're, quote unquote, displacing, or that you're, trying to blend in among, to really go from that. And then, of course, on the environmental side as well, there's a lot of legacies that we talked about with environmental law. There's a organization called Earth Justice that was originally called the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, that was actually created for the Mineral King fight to sort of be a separate entity for that legal battle and then future legal battles. So really was cool to see. And then within Disney, there's a lot of little Easter eggs of things. There was one of the Mickey Mouse Christmas wintertime things a couple of years ago where Mickey and the gang actually take a trip to Mineral King, which was really funny to see. So it definitely continues to resonate kind of in all those areas, which is really fun to write about. And, I'm sure there'll be more stuff that we'll see in Disney over the years that are fun little Easter eggs for that.
Our jaw, I think, dropped, by the way, when we saw that Mickey Mouse. I think we just turned it on for fun, didn't we?
Yeah.
I think we weren't even... we're like, oh, there's a Mickey Mouse store. It'd be kind of fun to see. And we were just like, what?
Yeah, really weird.
Because a lot of what we see is, Disney kind of doesn't talk about this. It's kind of this weird thing that but now there's been a couple recent Easter eggs and things like that. Again, people could read about even a couple more that are in the book. but yeah, so that was fun to see.
Oh yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, because they don't. I mean, it'd be like if they referenced their failed Disney's America park that they like to
Yeah.
not really talk about. Even though that one even seemed like they talk about it even less. But yeah, I love Alani. I was able to go there a few years ago. Thought it was really cool, and then Animal Kingdom Lodge, and then Animal Kingdom itself obviously has a lot of background. Well, I want to finish. I know that Kathyrn, you mentioned being a big Disney fan and growing up that way, and you're kind of pulled Greg in a bit. But what do you, when I don't want to speak for you, Greg. What do you like to do as far as the parks or Disney, or kind of what is kind of your things that you enjoy, or what made you connect with it originally?
Oh my gosh. I mean, for me, my first trip, I was 4 years old at Walt Disney World, and my family continued to go. I mean, even everyone as adults. I mean, kids and stuff came into the fold as well, but like my parents who are in their 70s, they'll lie and say they don't, but they go by themselves. Like they
Oh
still
yeah.
travel, go, they love so I grew up in a very Disney, certainly a Disney family. It's just very nostalgic for me. And even I'm not, and Greg will say this too, but we're not even like the biggest like thrill ride. I mean, I actually like it, I think more than Greg does, some of the thrill rides and stuff, but I just kind of like the old, like walking around, like some of the very slow moving, like the Pirates ride and Carousel of Progress. And we had actually just gone to Walt Disney World after actually a few years hiatus, just with COVID and the book and everything else, of course. So good to be back. But we saw all the Christmas stuff, and that's so beautiful. I'm such like an old Hollywood fan as well. So Hollywood Studios is my favorite park, always has been. And I love this deep connection to the company's history. I think what is so cool, and I do feel like sometimes they're getting away from it a little bit as far as kind of bringing in the Marvel and the Star
Yeah.
Wars. Not to say I don't like that, but I love when they kind of connect to the very old history, especially of like Walt. They just put up another statue of Walt in
Yeah.
Epcot. Things like that. I just think is so cool that they continue to root themselves in that. Maybe not quite as much, maybe as they have in the past, but I like that part of it.
Yeah, I mean it's cool to see that, and I agree with you, and glad that you've been able to enjoy it. So, Greg, no thrill rides for you, you know?
We just went, so we just took this trip to Florida and we were able to go like on the Guardians ride. And yeah, I don't know if it's,
Greg shakes his head
I don't know
every
if
time
it's, if
after.
it's for me. I'll just go do like the Mexico boat ride or something.
That's more your speed.
That's more my speed for sure.
Excellent.
Literally.
Well, I'm glad you got to go, and even if you had to ride Guardians and shake your head, that you still had fun. So, are there other topics? It can be Disney or not Disney that now that this book is finished, that you might be interested. I mean, you probably can't tell me, but just overall, are you thinking about other topics maybe for future books?
Yeah, we definitely are. I mean, this one was really fun to write, and I think we learned so much about researching and just like the flow between research and writing and what to look for and different places to look that I think, yeah, definitely we have a couple ideas that are in the same vein. Nothing we probably want to totally announce, but yeah, some Disney or Disney adjacent things that I think are right for sort of the same kind of treatment that would be really fun to do that haven't really been covered as much. So I think, yeah, hopefully we can continue because we really enjoyed doing it and we have this great process in place now. We kind of miss it, we miss sort of the research and the writing. It was fun I mean, it was really hard at times and took a lot out of us, but it was enjoyable to do for sure.
Yeah, and to do something about something you're so passionate about too, I think is always like a dream come true, to kind of share kind of an unknown Disney story and hopefully do it in a compelling way, and hopefully to contribute to the Disney history narrative that's already robust and out there is very exciting. And then of course, the other side as well, which is extremely important to American history.
Oh yeah, and I mean as a Disney fan, but also as someone who just found it to be an interesting story, I appreciated both sides of it, and I'm glad that you took the approach you did because I think it made for a really interesting book. Well, I mean, if people want to learn more about the book or about you or connect online or anything, like where are good places to go to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the book itself is available, of course, on like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Goodreads, places like that. And we do have a website, DisneylandOnTheMountain.com, that tells you more about us. It does have links to where you can buy the book, and there's a contact form on there as well. So we'd love to hear from anybody who reads it that feels like reaching out just to let us know, what you thought or kind of which side you're on, that kind of thing.
Well, awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun to learn more about the book. I really enjoyed it. And thanks to both of you for coming on the podcast. This was great.
Oh, thank you so much. We had so much fun, Dan.
Yeah, great conversation.
If you would like to check out past episodes of the Tomorrow Society podcast, I do interviews with authors, filmmakers, former Disney Imagineers, lots of cool people like Kathryn and Greg. You can go to tomorrowsociety.com/podcasts with an S at the end, or just look back in your preferred podcast provider, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, whatever you use. All the episodes from the history of the Tomorrow Society podcast are there. That's 215 past episodes, so lots of fun things that you can enjoy. If you'd like to support the show, I don't have ads currently. We don't have sponsors. I try to keep this as clean as possible to just dive right into the meat of the show. There is a great way to do so to help out. As of this release, I have added a third tier on Patreon, the New Horizons tier, to go along with Dreamers and Doers. This one allows you to select a topic of a patron podcast. You can submit questions to future guests. You'll receive an extra free gift, and you will get access to bonus podcasts every few months about specific attractions. So lots of exciting new elements along with the past perks. If you'd like to check out this tier or any other way to help out, you can go to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society, or you can just buy me a Dole Whip. Go to tomorrowsociety.com/Dole Whip. Thanks to all of you. Just by listening, you're supporting the show and spreading the word. And I really appreciate all the support and am excited about where we're going in 2024. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, I'm going to be releasing episodes every week. And that is the plan going forward. There may be a point where I will take a break of a few weeks. And I'm not going to call them seasons, but the idea is to release episodes every week. And I just think it allows me to cover a wide range of different topics and talk to, like I mentioned, a cool collection of guests and just really hit the ground running here in 2024. And I hope you will join me for this ride. And along with that, I'm always looking for suggestions for the show, for guests, anything you would like to hear. I always love hearing from you. You can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. You can connect with me on any social media. I'm basically everywhere at Tomorrow Society, and that includes Blue Sky and Mastodon and Threads, some of the newer alternatives to Twitter and Facebook. If you are into those, definitely check it out. This episode is produced, hosted, and edited by me, Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next week, I will be talking for the first time with Arthur Levine, who has been covering theme parks forever at About.com. He now has a newsletter on Substack called About Theme Parks. And what we are going to do is dive into all of the exciting attractions that are opening in 2024. That includes at Disney, Universal, Silver Dollar City, regional theme parks all around the world. So much cool stuff. Arthur's awesome, and it was super fun to talk with them. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you're all doing awesome out there, and I will talk to you again next time.